The Volcarona Theorem, why typing is close to everything, which really, it is pretty close to everything.
False swipe gaming theorems are all about answering the question: why do certain Pokemon succeed while others do not? Such answers are not just found in simplistic form, i.e., why is this kind of Pokemon good with the answer because of X, Y, and Z, but also in explorations of their nuances, as in why X, Y, and Z is important. X, Y, Z has been different in each video, move pools, abilities, and so on. But today we're examining perhaps the most fundamental aspect of Pokemon, which plays heavily into its success. It's typing. It's usually the first thing we learn about a Pokemon, dating all the way back to when we chose between grass, fire, and water type starters, and it is indeed among the most important aspects of the game of Pokemon. Do you know your type advantages?
I know most of them. There are still some that actually get me. To be fair, though, like in like Gen 7, was it Gen 7 or Gen 8? Steel lost Dark resistance, right? That was like a Gen 7, Gen 8 ism. Like there have been so many rebalances that sometimes I remember like Gen 2, sometimes I remember Gen 4, sometimes I remember Gen 7 and 8. Like there are so many to remember. I know most of them.
After all, typing is so powerful that you could have a +6 special attack Ultra Necrozma using Draco Meteor, and it would still do a cool 0% to a level 1 Cleffa. Now, obviously, the game of Pokemon has a lot more to it than a simple Type A beats Type B beats Type C rock, paper, scissors dynamic. Water types don't always beat fire types, for example, and even when they do, it's still not quite so simple.
So, also on this subject, because I've had many discussions about this, there are typings that are just, they don't really need to be in the game. There are Pokemon runs into the issue of there being too many typings. I believe there's 18 currently with the introduction of Fairy type. There's just an oversaturation of it, which leads, don't get me wrong, to a varied game state. It leads to a theoretically not stale game state. However, you have typings that are just better. I would argue ground, almost at earth. Ground will always be better than rock because of that electric resist. If you have part ground typing, generally you're at a higher skill ceiling than something that is just a rock type. However, rock gets like Stone Edge and stuff. The way that we discussed it, and actually the Pokemon TCG is onto one. I think Dark and Poison could be pulled into one typing. I think that could be interesting. If you don't know, the Pokemon TCG used to have a Darkness. It is called Darkness in the TCG. Had a Darkness typing, and it had a Psychic typing. Psychic did constitute Psychic types like Mew, Mewtwo, Bruxish, etc., right? Or you have your Darkness Pokemon like Darkrai, Zoroark. Those are really the unique one, the staple poster child in the TCG. However, this was a Gen 8-ism, I believe. This was leaning into, I think, the Sword and Shield sets. Poison and Dark became one typing, so Toxicroak was now a Darkness type. You had Alolan Muck was a Darkness type. This was with Gen 7. This would have been Sun and Moon then. Okay. But yeah, no, like you have things like that where they consolidate that, and honestly, it does make sense in my opinion. You have the Dark type in video game, which is it's evil, Houndoom, Houndour, Zoroark, Darkrai, in Japanese I believe it's Aku, evil, right? And then you have your Poison typing. Those two could technically be consolidated into one. Same as TCG, Darkness and Psychic, just consolidate them into one type. Whether that be Poison or Dark, probably the Dark type, honestly. Ground and rock, you could probably do that. There's a couple redundancies there, and there are things like Tyranitar that in Sandstorm will just get the 50% bonus and to its special defense in Sandstorm. However, the redundancies can lead to certain good interactions like that, but they can also lead to certain detrimental interactions where like bug Pokemon, because the fabulous Miko and I, who is a fabulous arachnologist, definitely recommend checking her out. We were talking, bug types really just, the renaissance of them was about the end of Gen 5-ish with like Excelgor, Escavalier. Gens 1 through 4, bug types were the joke. They were meant to be the Pokemon that you leveled up early game, meant to showcase the evolution mechanic, and after that they were generally just forgotten. Gen 5, Black and White, they did go through kind of a renaissance of the bug type, and then get Gen 6, Gen 7, where bug type is I would argue, a respected typing now. You got things like Bug Buzz, you got U-turn has always been a pretty good move and competitive, both singles and doubles. So the way that Pokemon used to work, at least when I came from it, because I technically started in Gen 3. I started in Fire Red. I remember going to Best Buy and my dad getting me Fire Red, and that was my first Pokemon game. Then went back to Crystal, Yellow, etc. However, I come from that era where certain typings just weren't relevant. So coming into modern day, where a lot of people can come in, came in Sun and Moon, they came in Gen 6, X and Y maybe, they came in Gen 8, maybe even Gen 9 or the Let's Go series, and they have all these typings. They're like, oh wow, no, all these typings are cool, all these typings have purpose. And don't get me wrong, like Gen 1, technically Parasect and Beedrill did have, no, it was Paris. Paris and Beedrill did have a niche against things like technically Mewtwo against the Psychic type, because Bug was the only thing super effective because Ghost was bugged out in Gen 1. I digress. Yeah, so I come from an era where certain typings were just invalid, to sum it up. Like, they just weren't... You had to have a higher skill level and know what you were doing to make them work. Not that you don't nowadays, just understand that there were certain typings that just weren't really viable. So there are some redundancies in there. Ice and Water could theoretically become one typing, because Ice typing, I'd argue, is the worst typing in the game in regards to defense. Obviously, you have things like Chien Pao, you have things like Weavile that have just been just bonkers in their respective metas, because Ice is a very good offensive typing. However, Pokemon, if you wanted to simplify the format, you could simplify some typings and consolidate them into singular typings.
But even so, typing is an integral aspect of the game of Pokemon, and it drives and shapes successes, failures, and forms of Pokemon and metagames. In this video, we'll be exploring how typing can be a blessing, a curse, or a mix of both, and which Pokemon better exemplifies this than everyone's favorite Fire Moth. As such, we present to you the Volcarona Theorem.
I do love my Atlas Moth. I do love Volcarona ever since Gen 5. I love him.
We'll jump right into Volcarona itself, and not just Volcarona, but others of its like. Those famously plagued by one of the worst weaknesses in the game, a quadruple weakness to Stealth Rock. Losing 50% of your health just for switching in is more than your Garden Variety hurdle to overcome. Of course.
So Stealth Rock, the way it sets up, if you aren't aware, Stealth Rock is a quote-unquote status move. What it does is you use your move to set up quote-unquote pointed stones at your opponent's feet. Now, there are certain things that can try to get around this. You get Magic Bounce that can bounce it right back. You have Rapid Spin, right? Rapid Spin, you kind of spin them away, spin the rocks away. There are ways to get rid of arena hazards. It does set up an arena hazard, and the way that the damage is calculated is depending on your weakness to rock. If you have a double weakness to rock, Charizard, Volcarona, cough cough, you're taking 50% of your HP bar as damage. If you have a singular weakness to rock, so say, for example, if you're a flying type, right? Just a pure flying type, you're Tornadus, right? And you come on in, you're going to be taking 25% of your health bar damage. If you have a neutrality to it, you're taking, is it, God, I'm trying to remember. It's not an eighth, is it? I think it's, no, because resistance is an eighth. Double resist is a 16th, right? I'm trying to remember what the, anyways, that's the calculations. I can't math right now, I apologize. But that's effectively how it works. You set up a arena trap, or arena hazard, that when your opponent switches in, which you can, yes, use things like Roar, Whirlwind, Iron Tail, things to swap them out so they swap on again to get chip damage off. It's very popular in terms of competitive, especially singles.
Of course, Volcarona did get banned in Generation 9 recently for being able to change its typing through terrestrialization, whether it was to gain further boost on a stab while minimizing the weaknesses of its original dual typing by shifting to just Bug or Fire, or
I didn't know that it got banned. Baby, I love you!
Changing to a different type entirely to thwart would-be counterattacks, but it's hardly unique in that regard, as the incredible offensive-defensive mechanic, especially alongside the incredible coverage of Terra Blast, has been abused by many an excellent Pokemon since the generation came out. Sometimes Pokemon with this weakness can thrive. In addition to Volcarona, there's also Mega Charizard Y, and if you extend the gamut to Ubers, Ho-Oh. But that is a matter of attributes beyond just their typing. The flip side of this coin is that Pokemon like Butterfree would likely still be terrible, even if they possess a quadruple resistance to Stealth Rock. Of course, there are plenty of Pokemon who are rife with potential, but are simply too ruined by rocks to be used consistently in the highest tiers, or sometimes even at all. From Yanmega to Moltres to Articuno to, most famously, base Charizard. Even the Smogon bird itself, Talonflame, wound up falling out of favor in ORAS OU after some time from how crippling its Stealth Rock weakness was, without being impactful enough to necessitate such a hindrance. In regards to type,
I mean, wasn't ORAS technically after a Gale Wings nerf, right? Because you had X and Y that had Gale Wings at full power. I know Gen 7 I know for a fact Gen 7 had incredibly had nerfed Gale Wings, because you Gale Winged Brave were just spam. I don't remember if Orez had Gale Wings get nerfed or not. I'm pretty sure it did. I'm pretty sure it was nerfed from X and Y. Because we had some rebalances, like Mega Genghis-Khan. How Mega Genghis-Khan X and Y was absolutely broken. Like, its power punch was just a swords dance with damage. It was great.
Typing itself, even the likes of Volcarona, great as it is plagued by it. In pre-heavy duty boost generations, all the team support in the world isn't always sufficient to protect them from the pesky presence of pebbles. And it does affect them greatly. Many of Volcarona sweep has been neutered by it only being at half health when attempting to set up its quiver dance. This even affects its item choice. It would absolutely love to run Life Orb or other offensively geared items, and it sometimes does. Yet often leftovers or even Citrus Berry are chosen to help offset its Stealth Rock weakness, and in Gen 8 and beyond, heavy duty boots are downright required. And Volcarona isn't just hindered by its rock weakness either. Being weak to water is far from good no matter what generation. However, as much as Volcarona's typing holds it back, it is also the source of its power.
Depending on the format you're in. I mean, really. So if you're taking Volcarona Ubers, right? Or VGC, potentially, if you have Uber Pokemon like Kyogre. If Kyogre's in the format, you have to be cognizant of Kyogre. I'm going to run Volcarona. Okay, how do you deal with Kyogre? What? How do you deal with Kyogre? You can absolutely run Volcarona. Absolutely. You run whatever you want. Understand from a connection standpoint, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with Kyogre? How do you deal with Pelipper? How do you deal with rain teams? How do you deal with Stealth Rock? How do you deal with Stone Edge, and or Rock Slide spam, right? How do you deal with Landorus? How do you deal with Kyogre, right? These are the questions that you're going to have to ask, and not that it's a bad question. Absolutely, these questions are why competitive exists, Competitive Pokemon shows us there are problems. We encounter problems, right? Say minimize Chansey, for example. Okay, we have encountered a problem. How are we going to solve it? You solve it by X, Y, Z, A, B, C. That's all competitive is I have an answer to the most multitude of problems. And honestly, don't get me wrong, there's going to be some things that are just certain auto losses. From Yu-Gi-Oh, for example, from my understanding, when people build decks for a YCS, one of the higher events, right, they will build for it trying to win the most number of matches, but they will acknowledge that some games they are just going to lose with how they're built. So if you go to locals, it's going to be a different environment. I'm not talking about the kid that just shows up with a sandwich bag full of unsleeved Yu-Gi-Oh cards and a rubber band, right? We've all done this. No, I'm not talking about that kid. I'm talking about just like go to at a Yu-Gi-Oh locals, because I know no one around here does it anymore, right? You'll show up and you'll have people. They're playing Sword Soul Tenyi. They're playing Branded as soon as it came out. They're playing XYZ ABC. They're playing they're playing meta decks, but the way you go into a YCS is a little different, because yes, you're kidding to win the most amount of games as possible, but you're going for the 7X, right? You're trying to win the majority of your games, but you're going to try to be taking the acceptable losses. Obviously, you should be trying to win every one of your games. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes people will maximize their efficiency, maximize their win rate in exchange for their known guaranteed losses. Now, how this applies to Pokemon, for instance, is, say, for example, if you're playing just casually with friends, or say the exact same format, right? Say you're using Kyogre's Zacian team, right? And say your opponent's using something that can counter Kyogre's Zacian, right? You might, in a general setting, have a generalized move pool. However, say, for instance, you're not running the close combat for some reason on your Zacian, right? You could show up to a Pokemon regionals. You could show up to a Pokemon, like a higher Pokemon event, and be like, you know what? There's going to be there's going to be some Mamoswine there. Mamoswine's doing really popular. You're going to be looking at some Dark types that are popular. Maybe there's going to be, maybe you're worried about Zoroark, right? Maybe Zoroark is going to be a concern. Say he got buffed or something like that, right? Hypotheticals. You're going to be like, okay, well, I don't need Protect on Zacian for this. I want to make my Zacian for this environment going into this competitive scene incredibly hyper offensive. I want him to crack my opponent's board, and then I'm going to clean him up. So you can see how, from a generalized standpoint, yeah, you can run like Protect and something on like Zacian, right? Assuming it's Protect, I don't actually remember his move pool. But like you go into a hyper competitive environment, or to a regionals, Worlds even, and you're going to be changing things up a little bit. I like to cite Sajin Park's Pachirisu took Worlds because he saw a problem. He said, I know how to address this, and he went and he won.
Firebug is a wonderfully complementary stab combination. Not only does it give Volcarona superb super effective coverage, but the two types also hit each other's resist at least neutrally. Though not usually thought of as such, its typing is also quite useful defensively, which is why you'll occasionally see bulky or even outright defensive Volcarona sets. Resisting Fairy, Fighting, Ice, Steel, and Grass is quite valuable after all, and it's these resists in conjunction with its many neutralities that give it such a unique defensive presence. Neutrality is a huge part of the typing negotiation that goes on in battles, and that's part of why Volcarona is so hard to stop from setting up. It's neutral to a lot, and it's got the bulk to take many neutral hits. Before Kyurem got banned from Gen 8 OU, Volcarona was one of the few Pokemon capable of taking on many of its sets, not just because it resisted ice, but because it was neutral to other moves it liked using. Volcarona perfectly illustrates the duality of typing, as both its weaknesses and strengths intertwine to form the backbone of its identity. So too do its Quad Rock's weak companions. The many fire-flying Pokemon are both burdened by their weaknesses to electric and blessed by their immunity to ground.
Right.
Of course, one doesn't have to possess a Volcarona tier weakness to Stealth Rock to be bothered by the move, but there are plenty of Rock's weak flying and fire types that succeed in spite of it. So why is it that Ice types, which are equally bothered by Rocks, have a much tougher time finding that same success?
Ice types, as stated earlier, is one of the better offensive typings in the game. In terms of defensive, though, it's awful. It is probably the worst type in the game in terms of anything defensive.
Cool. Because the Ice type is loaded with weaknesses and only has one resist, which is to opposing Ice. Sure, Ice types tend to have a second typing, but the weaknesses of the Ice type have been dragging those secondary types down forever. For example, Cloyster in Gens 2 and 3 has just about no use for its Ice typing, while it is made significantly worse for its weaknesses to Fighting and Rock, as well as being neutral to Fire and Steel. Of course, on the offensive side of the spectrum, Ice is one of the most ferocious stabs in the game, but it is a difficult balance to strike. Contrast this with, say, Victini.
Ice is generally, quote-unquote, glass cannon. I mean, thematically, it does fit very well. It is not very defensive. It's going to shatter, quote-unquote. But if it goes off, it's going to go off, and you got to deal with it. Something Alola Ninetales shotgunning blizzards every turn. If you don't have an out to it, it's going to be a little rough.
It's got many weaknesses, but it's also overflowing with resistances. Fighting, Fairy, Psychic, Grass, Steel, Ice, Fire, which means it is constantly finding something to switch in against. Ice types pack the same weakness without the benefits. One doesn't even need to be plagued by a Stealth Rock weakness or a weakness to anything at all to know the downfalls of a lack of resistances. Normal types are only weak to Fighting, but their only resistance is a Ghost immunity.
Which actually does come in handy. Say, if, for example, Oranguru, normal Psychic. Oh, I'm just going to use a Ghost type on it. Wow. You forgot that normal type has the immunity. I've seen it a lot of times.
Make matters worse, they don't even have Ice's upside of wielding fearsome offensive stab. Normal doesn't hit anything super effectively at all. Normal's lack of weaknesses works for Pokemon like Chansey and Blissey.
I will argue, in Gen 1, however, specifically, in Gen 1, because mechanics, if you fire off a Hyper Beam and get the knockout, you don't have to recharge because of how it's coded. I would argue normal in Gen 1 can be busted. That's why Tauros was so good.
That are so over-the-top bulky, they don't need resist. But pretty much anything short of that isn't going to cut it, barring Gen 4 Clefable, whose access to one of the best abilities in the game, Magic Guard, is its own form of over-the-top excellence in how it completely neuters the passive damage omnipresent in Pokemon. Just as Chansey and Blissey neuter all manner of special attacks. Pretty much everything else, though, even Snorlax, an incredibly bulky Pokemon, couldn't handle Normal's complete lack of resistances as early on as Gen 3, let alone anything afterwards, and most normals aren't nearly as bulky as Snorlax. Even the occasional normal type with secondary typing would probably be better off without it. Gaining the fighting weakness or becoming neutral to fighting is just about never worth the Ghost immunity.
So remember how I said earlier in the video, how certain typings in the era that I started playing Pokemon just fell off after a little bit? This corroborates that, right? In Gen 3 specifically, normal typing, there was your Snorlax. You had your Slacking if you wanted to make a Slacking thing work. Actually, Pokemon Coliseum had Evice, right? The final boss. He had his Slowking ability swap with his Slacking, right? A really nutty set, actually. If you've never played Pokemon Coliseum, one of the hardest Pokemon games in terms of level curve I have ever played, and it's official Pokemon games. It's great. But yeah, normal type and bug typing were one of, like, sure, you used your normal typings early game. Sure, you had your Pidgeotto, you had your Fearow. You know, you didn't get Snorlax until you got the Pokeflute, which was after. It was about the time of the Force Badge. I always forget Kanto because I always do it different each time, because there's like 50 some odd ways you can do it after Misty, right? Anyways, moving on. But like, yeah, normal type was also one of those where like normal type existed. What did it do? It existed because at this time, remember, we didn't have Hyper Beam do its not recharge anymore. We actually didn't get Giga Impact till I think Gen 4, so which is this generation that is currently in Battle Revolution. Bug type, normal type, they kind of petered off a little bit. Like, don't get me wrong, there's the people that can use it to great effect still. There are teams that I'm sure absolutely utilize the normal type for that ghost resist, right? However, bug and normal just didn't really do a whole hell of a lot. It really wasn't to me until Gen 7 when Snorlax was starting to do things, because Gen 6 I didn't actually play VGC. I took a lot break from VGC 5 and 6. I just kind of like played Pokemon casually. But I remember Gen 7 Sun and Moon where Snorlax was showing like VGC representation. I was using a Recycle Berry set at that point in time, but normal typing had seen a resurgence in usage. And I mean, even now we have, what is it, Hisuian Zoroark with, is it normal Ghost, I think? But yeah, no, Hisuian Zoroark is like, normal typing can be a boon. We have our Rangaroo, as I mentioned earlier, showcasing that, oh, well, you're a Psychic weak, but now you're normal. So now you are not weak to Psychic, or not weak to Ghost, excuse me. But it's good. I like how they've kind of rehabilitated some of these typings that had just become lost to time and power crept out of the game.
Normals tend to fail on both offense and defense. At least ice types are among the scariest threats in the game. Funnily enough, both normal and ice types were superb in Generation 1, which is an effective reminder that good typing can be generational. Before Generation 6, poison typing was generally not desirable. The weaknesses to Psychic and Earthquake were significant, and its resistance to fighting and Toxic, while valuable, weren't quite good enough to outweigh them. Generation 4 helped by giving grounded poison types the ability to absorb toxic spikes upon entry, but it still wasn't enough to fundamentally change their place in the typing hierarchy. That wouldn't come until Generation 6, with poison's dominance of the fairy type, both resisting it and hitting it super effectively. Indeed, part of the reason poison hadn't been so highly valued beforehand was because there were so many resistances to it. You wouldn't want to spam it as an attack. However, with the shifting landscape of the fairy-infested Gen 6 and onwards, suddenly you could very feasibly get strong mileage out of moves like Sludge Wave from Gengar and Nidoking and Sludge Bomb from Mega Venusaur. Additionally, the increased power of fighting types over the generations and the decreased value of psychic types meant that poisons were better off as a whole.
I mean, certain moves have been rebalanced as well. So remember how in like roughly Gen 3, right, Zubat Cave, all the Zubat knew Leech Life? And so it was like a 15 power move. I had never used it until like Gen 7 when like I started looking at this. I'm like, wait, is this the same move? Yeah, no, Leech Life got like a buff to like 80 base power. It was nutty. And I'm like, there's no way these Zubat were hitting this hard, because they weren't. It was a base 15 power. Pokemon throughout time has recognized there are certain things that just fall off, or take certain things that, like the poison typing, like Leech Life, that sure, they kind of did a thing, but they didn't really do the thing well. And they modernized it and buffed it in a way that it is for modern consideration, right? Where you can use a Gengar with Sludge Wave and to actually deal with some threats like the Tapus. Where you can use Leech Life for a big, strong, bulky bug type, Gliscopod, my beloved, to regain some health. Now finally got rid of Emergency Exit. Anything else, please. But yeah, no, it's interesting how Pokemon over the years has evolved in regards to certain buffs they've given. And this is a really good typing video to showcase that these typings used to be good or weren't good, and this is kind of where we stand now, but we could also go places further depending on how the metagames develop.
Greatest example of typing's impact being generational is Dragon. In the first 3 generations, it ranged from decent to actively harmful, almost like what normal typing would become. Its resists weren't bad, but hardly essential. While its stab options ranged from non-existence to terrible to decent, its peerless neutral coverage was nice, but the power wasn't exactly game-breaking, and the super effective hit only against other dragons was similar. Useful? Sure. Hugely significant? significant? Not quite. Then in Generation 4, Draco Meteor was introduced. Outrage was buffed, and the fact that Dragon's only resistance was steel finally actually meant something, especially helped out by the fact that the new physical special split meant Dragon Dance could boost physical Dragon Stab, and new items like Life Orb and Choice Specs ensured everything was power crept.
This is actually a good segue into the physical special split. So if you don't know, prior to Gen 4, there was a split between typings being physical or special. Now you're like, Kip, what does that mean? That doesn't make sense. It really didn't. So that's actually why Flareon wasn't good, because it had 130 base attack stat. But if you used a fire move prior to Gen 4 would always be special. A ground move would always be physical. And there were splits between types that were physical and special. I mean, this is just a design product of the era. Gen 4, they addressed this, and they did the physical special split, so we could get things like Earthquake, which are physical, and Earth Power, which are on the special side. This does play into how typings, certain typings were better because they could actually, and Pokemon were better because they got actually, use their moves to great effect. Cough Cough Flareon not being able to, being a fire type, but all fire moves only being special, to, we get Gen 4, where, something with a... theoretically, a Flareon got Flare Blitz, right, in Gen 4, right? Oh, well, Flareon now has Flare Blitz in Gen 4, a physical fire move that can now use its 130 base physical attack. Interesting.
With all of this, Dragon rose to become the defining type in Generations 4 and 5. With such immense power behind the attacks being neutral to Dragon in many cases, meant an argument could be made for being weak to it. Such was their KO potential, and since that went for every non-steel, that went for a lot of Pokemon. Plus, there were plenty of Dragons duking it out for the cases of actual super effective hits as well. Dragon was so powerful and prominent in Generation 4, it introduced the team building rule for every team needing at least one steel, and at the peak of the Latias and Salamence fueled Dragon dominance, that rule was more like 2 or even 3. There was quite a fair share of successful teams with the structure of 3 Dragons, 3 steel. Then Generation 5 came around, and the Dragon-powered metagame reached even higher Draco Meteoric heights. Spamming Dragon moves was easy, riskless, and yielded results. They were so strong that even resistant steel types had the nasty tendency of taking heavy damage. Then Generation 6 came around and added fairy types, and suddenly being a Dragon type wasn't all that anymore. Sure, Dragons were and continue to be excellent Pokemon, but the days of mindlessly spamming Dragon moves were decidedly over. Now, if you wanted to use a Dragon type, it had to offer something else, like its resistances, which previously were generally more of the excuse needed to get the Dragon on the field for its big damage, but now were its source of value in and of themselves. Dragon moves remained threatening as well, of course, but were no longer the metagame warping bombs one could toss around without a second thought to damage everything to some degree. In fact, in Generation 7 and onwards, Fairy type became so popular that many Dragons regularly didn't even pack Dragon Stab anymore. If Dragons are the quintessential example of generational typing, then its former lone resist Steel stands as its direct opposite. It has been far and away the best defensive typing in the game since its inception in Generation 2. It boasts a stunning list of resistances, and even when it lost 2 of them in Gen 6, which are Dark and Ghost, it received
so it was Gen 6, I was right.
An incredible new one in Fairy. Remember how normal and ice typing are such hindrances that they tend to drag down the dual type Pokemon saddled with them? Well, steel typing is the opposite of that. It elevates everything that has it. Bug types are famously flawed, but as soon as Fortress or Scizor or Genesect grab that secondary steel typing, they become among the best Pokemon around.
They really do, though. So, like, for example, there are certain typings that if you have it, you have to look at a Pokemon. So, for example, if you have Dragon typing, in my opinion, I'm looking at you. If you have the combination Steel Fairy, which already Steel's good, Fairy's good. If you have Steel Fairy, I'm looking at you. Can I utilize you? Can I use you? Which, what Steel Fairies do we have? Klefki, Zacian Crown. They're really good. I'm sure there's others that I'm missing, right, offhand. But I mean, like, Steel Fairy is one of those type. Tinkatuff, right, the Tinkaton line. Less usage, but still has it. You still look at it because you are Steel Fairy. You are one of the best typings in the game. And you had Mega Altaria, which had the unique Fairy Dragon typing, which I don't think we've gotten back yet, which I'm really sad about. Like, if you have Steel typing, I kind of look at you like, can I utilize you in some capacity? Escavalier, Scizor, Ferrothorn, right? I mean, I look at you and I'm like, okay, you have piqued my interest because of this typing.
Several of the best, most long-lasting defensive Pokemon ever, like Skarmory, Heatran, and Ferrothorn, do so off of the strength of being Steel. Steel typing is so good that even partial Ice typing can't bring it down. See Alolan Sandslash, which is quite an effective Pokemon, and that's just defensively. While Steel isn't known as a meta-game crushing offensive type, it's been dishing out huge damage as far back as Generation 3, where Metagross and its Meteor Mash burst onto the scene. Generation 4 upped the ante with Scizor's Bullet Punch, Jirachi's Iron Head, and Magnezone's Flash Cannon. Once Gen 6 added the Fairy type, Steel gained another super effective target, becoming more overall efficient in the same way the Poison type did. Previously, Steel offense wasn't used for its widespread coverage, but now the likes of Bisharp threaten a greater portion of the metagame with it.
Right.
Now, before we get into our final typing, we must give an honorable mention to immunity abilities, which effectively act as an extension of typing, with none of the downsides. The most glaring example is Levitate, which has bestowed Earthquake and Spikes immunities onto many Pokemon who are incredibly dependent on it ever since Gen 3. Volt Absorb, Lightning Rod, and Motor Drive take it a step further, making the Pokemon with them not just immune to electric moves like a ground type would be, but actually getting stronger when hit by them. Then there's Flash Fire, Water Absorb, and Storm Drain. These abilities create immunities that otherwise don't exist. There's no type that's immune to fire or water, but with these abilities, that aspect gets factored into something like Heatran's list of resistances, just as anything else would. Finally, Ground Flying is one of the most elite combinations in the game as well, with a lengthy list of valuable resistances to go along with the eternal reliability that is Stab Earthquake.
Let's start with just Landorus. Landorus is an example of the I would argue, pinnacle, the apex of ground flying.
Ground flying is so good, it had people making Gligar work in Gen 3 OU. And Gligar is far from a good Pokemon in its own right. It was carried nearly fully by its typing. Being a ground type is already one of the most desirable traits in Pokemon, and so is being a flying type. Fittingly, when you pair these two, the results are some of the best Pokemon around. Gliscor was incredible right from Generation 4 before it even had Poison Heal, and both forms of Landorus have been among the most impactful competitive Pokemon to ever exist on both sides of the offensive-defensive spectrum.
If Landorus is in a format, you have to consider Landorus. If Landorus is in a format, you have to understand, how do I deal with Landorus? That is the just warping ability he has on the format.
Once Eviolite came out and its move pool expanded a little bit, Gligar made full use of its amazing typing in the lower tiers as well. But even before that, it was one of the best Pokemon in Generation 4 Little Cup. Ground Flying is the kind of dual type version of being Steel. You can give it to pretty much anything and it'll put in a lot of work off of that alone. And that's it. While typing obviously isn't everything, it provides the bedrock for pretty much every other aspect of Pokemon to work off of. It's not just about super effective and not very effective either. Neutrality plays a great role. Part of the reason Volcarona is so dangerous after all is that it's neutral to many attacks, which it can survive and quiver dance in the face of. Now, of course, the super effective side and the dance to abuse or avoid it is much of what competitive Pokemon is all about, and its impact can't be overstated. If there's a successful competitive Pokemon, odds are its typing plays a gigantic role in its success. Thanks for watching, everyone. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about this theorem? Are there any other theorems you'd want to see? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. And thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos. And thank you to everyone else watching as well.
No, this is great. I really liked this. I thought this was a good video. I thought this was another good theorem. Typing is just that important. It really is to consider. It's one of the biggest things you consider when team building, I would argue.
And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.
Absolutely epic video. Absolutely awesome False Swiping team. Thank you for putting that out. I really like that. Thought it was a good, I wasn't expecting this, and then I saw it, and I'm like, oh, this is going to be good, and it was good. I'm glad I looked into it. Very important to consider. Learn your type matchups, at least most of them. You'll be fine. Excellent video.